Ruth's fingers finally settled on the first photograph, sliding it across the metal table with deliberate precision. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows that made the sisters' faces look like ancient masks carved from yellowed bone. "This one," Ruth whispered, her voice carrying the weight of 3 decades. "This is where it started." Maggie forced herself to look down. The photograph showed a wooded area she recognized immediately, the old Sinclair property on the outskirts of Pine Ridge. In the foreground, a child's bicycle lay on its side, training wheels still attached. Tommy Morrison's bike, 7 years old when he disappeared on June 15, 1994, the first victim. "We know about the bicycle," Maggie said, keeping her voice steady despite the rapid hammering of her heart. "It was found 3 days after Tommy went missing. What we don't know is how it got there." Evelyn Harrow spoke for the first time since entering the room, her voice a raspy whisper that seemed to scratch the air. "Detective Chen, what we're about to tell you will change how you see everyone you work with, everyone you trust." Her pale blue eyes fixed on Maggie with an intensity that made the already stifling room feel smaller. "Are you prepared for that?" The question hung in the humid air like smoke. Through the reinforced window, Maggie could see the prison yard where other inmates moved in slow circles, their orange uniforms bright against the scorched grass. Everything about this place spoke of containment, of secrets locked away, but now those secrets were threatening to spill free. "I've been preparing for 30 years, Maggie replied, though even as she said it, she wondered if that was true. Could anyone really prepare for the moment when their life's work might crumble? Ruth pushed another photograph across the table. This one showed what appeared to be the interior, a basement. Stone walls, exposed beams, and something that looked like an altar made of stacked stones. Dark stains covered the floor around it. "The children weren't taken randomly," Ruth said. "They were chosen, selected for their vulnerability." Tommy Morrison's father was an alcoholic who barely noticed when the boy went missing for hours at a time. Jenny Patterson lived with her grandmother, who was going blind. Marcus Webb's mother worked 3 jobs. She paused, studying Maggie's face. "Your daughter Sarah played alone in Riverside Park every day after school while you worked late on our case." The words hit Maggie like a physical blow. Her hand moved instinctively to her service weapon, a gesture born of 15 years of hypervigilance. "How do you know about Sarah's routine?" "Because we were watching," Evelyn said simply. "Not us personally, you understand, but the network was extensive. People you'd never suspect. People who wore badges and sat in church pews and coached Little League." She leaned forward slightly, her shackles clanking against the table. "People who protected the real monsters while we sat in these cells, letting the world believe we were the ones responsible." The ceiling fan continued its lazy revolution, pushing the thick air in useless circles. Maggie's shirt stuck to her back with perspiration that had nothing to do with the Louisiana heat. In all her years of detective work, she'd learned to read people, to sense deception. But these women radiated something different. Not the desperation of the falsely accused, but the terrible calm of those who had been carrying an unbearable burden. "Why now?" Maggie asked. "After 30 years of silence, why are you talking now?" Ruth and Evelyn exchanged a look that spoke of decades of shared imprisonment, of conversations held in whispered conferences in their cells. "Because," Ruth said slowly, "the man who orchestrated everything is dying. Cancer. He has maybe 3 months left, and he's been reaching out to his old contacts, trying to tie up loose ends." "What kind of loose ends?" "The kind that know too much," Evelyn said. "The kind that might talk when they feel death approaching. The kind that might confess to clear their conscience before meeting their maker." Maggie's phone vibrated against her hip, a text message. She glanced at it reflexively and felt her blood turn to ice. The message was from an unknown number. "Some interviews should end before they begin. Your daughter wouldn't want you to make the wrong choice." The photograph Ruth had been preparing to share slipped from her fingers and fluttered to the floor. From her upside-down vantage point, Maggie could see it clearly. a group of men in what appeared to be police uniforms, standing in a circle around that same stone altar. The image was dark, grainy, but one face was clearly visible. Captain Robert Hendricks, her current supervisor, her mentor, the man who had guided her career for the past 20 years, the man who had personally assigned her to the Pine Ridge case the day after Sarah disappeared. Ruth followed Maggie's gaze to the fallen photograph. "Now do you understand, Detective Chen? This isn't about justice anymore. This is about survival." Maggie's hands trembled as she bent to retrieve the photograph, her fingers barely grazing the glossy surface before Ruth's shackled hand shot out to stop her. "Leave it," Ruth whispered urgently. "The cameras, they can't see what's on the floor from that angle." The interview room suddenly felt like a fishbowl, every surface reflecting the harsh fluorescent light. Maggie's eyes darted to the corner where the security camera's red light blinked steadily, recording everything. How many eyes were watching this conversation? How many belonged to people in that photograph? "I need to go," Maggie said, her voice hoarse. She stood abruptly, the metal chair scraping against concrete with a sound like fingernails on bone. "Detective," Evelyn called softly, "you can walk away now, but they already know you're here. They already know what we might tell you." Her pale eyes held something that might have been pity. The only safety now is in the truth. Maggie's service weapon felt impossibly heavy against her hip as she moved toward the door. Behind her, she could hear Ruth's voice, barely a whisper, "We'll be here when you're ready. But don't wait too long. Dead men tell tales, but only if there's someone alive to hear them." The drive back to New Orleans passed in a haze of swamp heat and Spanish moss draped like funeral shrouds from ancient oaks. Maggie's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles had gone white, and the air conditioning couldn't touch the cold sweat that had broken out across her forehead. Every few miles she checked her rearview mirror, though she couldn't say what she was looking for. The familiar weight of her daily routine should have been comforting when she finally reached the precinct. The same coffee-stained carpet in the bullpen, the same flickering fluorescent light over her desk, the same stack of case files that seemed to reproduce overnight like urban folklore. But everything felt different now, contaminated by the sisters' words, and that photograph burned into her memory. "Maggie, how'd it go with our famous sisters?" Captain Hendricks' voice boomed across the bullpen, and Maggie's blood turned to ice water. He approached with that same easy smile she'd trusted for 2 decades, coffee mug in hand, the one Sarah had given him for Christmas 8 years ago, with "World's Best Honorary Uncle" painted in cheerful red letters. "Nothing useful," Maggie heard herself say, the lie sliding out with practiced ease, same old deflections and mind games. They're lifers with nothing to lose and time to kill. Hendricks nodded, but his eyes, when had they become so calculating, seemed to search her face for tells. "That's what I figured. Waste of a drive, but we had to try. These old cases, sometimes they just stay cold, you know." The casual dismissal might have fooled her yesterday. Today, every word felt loaded with meaning she couldn't trust herself to interpret. "Bob," she said carefully, using the nickname that had felt natural for years, "do you remember much about the Pine Ridge assignments? How we decided who worked what angles?" His laugh came too quickly. "Christ, Maggie, that was 30 years ago. I barely remember what I had for lunch yesterday," but his knuckles had gone white around his coffee mug. Sarah's coffee mug. "Why? Something specific bothering you? Just trying to piece together the timeline." "For the report." "Right. Well, don't spend too much time looking backward. We've got fresh bodies that need solving." He turned away, then paused. "How's Sarah doing, by the way? Still teaching down in Baton Rouge?" The question was perfectly normal, the kind he'd asked 100 times before, but something in his tone made Maggie's skin crawl. "She's fine," she managed. "Good, good. Beautiful girl. You worry about her, I know. World's dangerous for young women these days." He took a slow sip from the mug, his eyes never leaving Maggie's face. "You should call her tonight. Make sure she's safe." After he walked away, Maggie sat at her desk staring at her phone screen. Sarah's contact information glowed back at her. Sarah Chen Martinez, the hyphenated name she'd taken after marrying Miguel 3 years ago. A small rebellion that had delighted Maggie at the time, her daughter refusing to disappear entirely into someone else's identity. The text from the unknown number was still there, stark and threatening. But beneath it was Sarah's last message from 2 days ago, a photo of her kindergarten class holding up finger paintings, all gap-toothed smiles and paint-stained smocks. The accompanying text read, teaching the next generation that purple dinosaurs are totally scientifically accurate. Love you, Mom. Normal. Safe. A life built carefully in the ruins of what had been lost 15 years ago. Maggie's finger hovered over Sarah's number. Around her, the precinct hummed with its usual chaos, ringing phones, heated conversations, the eternal shuffle of paperwork and coffee runs. Her ordinary world, the one she'd constructed so carefully after everything fell apart, the one that might be built on lies older than her career. She put the phone away without calling. The phone on Maggie's desk erupted into shrill rings at 11:47 p.m., shattering the relative quiet of the night shift. She'd been staring at the same incident report for 20 minutes, the words swimming together in a meaningless blur, while her mind replayed the photograph of Captain Hendricks standing over that stone altar. The sound made her jump so violently that her coffee cup toppled, sending lukewarm liquid cascading across the papers. Detective Chen. Her voice came out rough, strained. Sarah's voice was wrong, tight with a fear that Maggie recognized from 15 years of nightmares. Mom, something happened. Someone was in my house. Precinct tilted sideways. Maggie gripped the phone with both hands, pressing it against her ear as if she could somehow reach through the connection and pull her daughter to safety. Are you hurt? Where are you? I'm okay. I'm at Miguel's parents' house. But Mom... Sarah's voice cracked, and Maggie could hear her struggling not to cry. They didn't take anything. They left things, photos. What kind of photos? Of me. From today. From this week. One of me getting my mail yesterday morning. One through my classroom window while I was teaching. And Mom, there was one of you. From today. Walking out of some prison. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed to pulse with the rhythm of Maggie's heartbeat. Around the bullpen, the skeleton crew of night shift officers continued their work, oblivious to the fact that her world was dissolving. She forced herself to speak calmly. Sarah, listen to me. Stay exactly where you are. Don't go back to your house. Don't go anywhere alone. I called the local police, but they said without signs of forced entry or actual theft. Forget the local police. The words came out sharper than Maggie intended. She couldn't trust anyone now, not even small-town cops she'd never met, not when she didn't know how deep this conspiracy ran. I'm coming to get you. Mom, what's happening? This is about one of your cases, isn't it? Maggie closed her eyes, seeing again Ruth Harrow's pale fingers pushing that photograph across the metal table. Your daughter played alone in Riverside Park every day after school while you worked late on our case. They'd been watching Sarah then. They were watching her now. Pack a bag, Maggie said. Enough for a few days. Don't tell anyone where you're going, not even Miguel's family. I'll explain everything when I get there. After hanging up, Maggie sat in the harsh precinct lighting, feeling the weight of 30 years of certainty crumbling around her. The Harrow sisters had been right. There was no safety in ignorance anymore. The moment she'd walked into that interview room, she'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Her computer screen showed the Pine Ridge case files, still open from her earlier research. 30 years of investigation, thousands of pages of reports and witness statements and forensic evidence, all leading to the conviction of 2 elderly women who might have been scapegoats. And buried somewhere in those files were the real answers, hidden in plain sight by people she'd trusted with her career, her life, her daughter's safety. The choice crystallized with brutal clarity. She could pretend this conversation had never happened, File a report that dismissed the sisters' claims as the desperate fantasies of lifers with nothing to lose. Go back to her ordinary world of solvable murders and comprehensible evil. Let sleeping secrets lie. Or she could follow this thread wherever it led, even if it destroyed everything she'd built from the ashes of her first failure. Maggie's hands moved without conscious decision, pulling up her department access codes and beginning to download every file related to Pine Ridge. Personnel records, evidence logs, interview transcripts, everything she could carry on a thumb drive. If there was a conspiracy, there would be traces. There always were. Her desk phone rang again. This time, the caller ID showed Captain Hendrick's home number. "Working late, Maggie?" His voice carried that same casual warmth, but now she could hear something else underneath it, something watchful and cold. "Saw your computer access logs. Doing some follow-up research on our Pine Ridge trip?" The lie came easily. "Couldn't sleep. Figured I'd organize my notes while they were fresh." Good thinking. Though you might want to be careful about which files you access this late at night. Sometimes the system flags unusual activity for review. A pause. Wouldn't want anyone getting the wrong idea about your research methods. The threat was gentle, wrapped in grandfatherly concern, but unmistakable. Maggie's fingers continued moving across the keyboard, copying files even as she spoke. "Of course, just routine follow-up. I'm glad we understand each other. Give Sarah my love, won't you?" The line went dead. Around her, the precinct's night shift continued their work, unaware that Detective Margaret Chen was stealing 30 years of evidence and preparing to disappear into a truth that might destroy them all. Maggie stared at the dead phone in her hand, Hendrick's words echoing like a death knell in the stifling precinct air. "Give Sarah my love." The casual malice of it made her stomach lurch. He knew. Somehow, he already knew about the break-in, about the photographs scattered across Sarah's kitchen table like a promise of violence. The thumb drive felt impossibly small in her palm as the download bar crept toward completion. 30 years of evidence reduced to a few gigabytes of data that might either save her daughter or sign both their death warrants. Her hands shook as she watched the progress indicator, 78%, 79%, 80%, each percentage point carrying the weight of everything she was about to lose. This was insanity. The rational part of her mind, the part that had guided her through 2 decades of careful police work, screamed at her to stop. Delete the files. Drive to Baton Rouge and bring Sarah home, pretend the interview had never happened. File a report dismissing the sisters' claims as the paranoid delusions of lifers desperate for attention. But she couldn't forget the look in Ruth Harrow's eyes when she'd mentioned Sarah's name. Not triumph or malicious satisfaction, but something far more chilling, recognition. The knowledge of someone who had watched a 7-year-old girl from the shadows, measuring her vulnerability like a predator calculating distance to prey. "Your daughter played alone in Riverside Park every day after school while you worked late on our case." Maggie's throat constricted as fragmented memories surfaced. Sarah's drawings from that terrible summer 30 years ago, crayon figures of men in blue uniforms standing among trees. "The nice policeman who watched me at the park," Sarah had explained with the matter-of-fact innocence of childhood. Maggie had been touched at the time, grateful that her colleagues cared enough to check on her daughter during those long days when the Pine Ridge investigation consumed her life. How had she been so blind? The download completed with a soft chime that sounded like a funeral bell in the empty bullpen. Maggie pulled the thumb drive free and slipped it into her jacket pocket, then began methodically clearing her browser history and access logs. Not that it mattered, they would know what she'd taken, but old habits of operational security died hard. Around her, the precinct felt like a museum of her former life. The coffee-stained desk where she'd written hundreds of reports. The bulletin board covered with crime scene photos and witness statements. A mosaic of human tragedy she'd spent decades trying to solve. The framed commendations on the wall, each one signed by Captain Robert Hendricks, marking milestones in a career that might have been orchestrated by the very evil she'd been hunting. Her service weapon sat heavy on her hip, and she found herself wondering how many times she'd walked these halls alongside people who knew the truth about Pine Ridge. How many conversations had she participated in? How many theories had she shared, while monsters in police uniforms smiled and nodded and carefully steered her away from dangerous truths? The night shift supervisor, Detective Morrison, no relation to Tommy Morrison, the first victim, despite the shared name that had always struck her as grimly coincidental, glanced up from his paperwork as she gathered her things. "Heading out early?" he asked. His voice was friendly enough, but she found herself studying his face for signs of deception, wondering if paranoia was already consuming her rational mind. "Yeah, Sarah needs me for something." The truth disguised as a casual explanation. How many times had she done this in reverse, accepting seemingly innocent statements that concealed deadly secrets? Morrison nodded and returned to his work, but she could feel his eyes following her as she walked toward the exit. In the parking garage, shadows seemed deeper than usual, the fluorescent lights casting harsh pools of white that left too many dark spaces between the cars. Every footstep echoed like a gunshot in the concrete cavern. Her hands fumbled with the car keys, muscle memory betraying her as adrenaline flooded her system. This was what prey felt like, that hyper-aware state where every sound might herald attack, where safety existed only in the next few seconds of continued breathing. She'd interviewed enough victims to recognize the symptoms, but she'd never experienced them herself. The engine turned over with a reluctant growl, and she pulled out of the garage into the humid New Orleans night. The French Quarter glowed in the distance, its neon promises of good times and easy living a sharp contrast to the nightmare she was driving toward. Jazz music drifted from open doorways as late-night revelers stumbled between bars, their laughter bright and careless in the thick air. How many of them knew they were dancing on top of secrets that could shatter everything they believed about their city, their protectors, their world? Maggie drove through empty streets toward the interstate, the thumb drive burning like a coal in her pocket. Behind her, the precinct lights grew smaller in the rearview mirror until they disappeared entirely, swallowed by the darkness that seemed to be consuming everything she'd once thought solid and real. The interstate stretched ahead like a black ribbon through the Louisiana night, and with each mile that passed beneath her tires, Maggie felt another thread connecting her to her old life snap. The speedometer needle climbed past 70, then 80, as if velocity alone could outrun the weight of what she'd set in motion. But there was no escaping it now. She was committed to a path that would either lead to justice or destroy everything she held sacred. Her phone buzzed against the passenger seat, Sarah's name lighting up the screen. Maggie let it ring once, twice, before answering on speaker. "Mom, where are you?" "Miguel's parents are asking questions, and I don't know what to tell them." "Tell them you're visiting me for a few days. Family emergency." Maggie's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, checking for headlights that might be following too closely. "Are you packed?" "Yeah, but Mom..." Sarah's voice carried that particular tone of frustrated concern that Maggie remembered from her teenage years. "You're scaring me. This isn't like you. What's really happening?" The question hung in the stale air of the car, demanding an answer Maggie couldn't give. Not yet. How could she explain that everything they'd built together, the careful reconstruction of their lives after those dark months when Katie had vanished, might have been orchestrated by the same people who'd stolen her first daughter? That the protective walls she'd erected around Sarah might have been made of lies? "I'll explain everything when I get there," she said instead. "Just trust me for now." After ending the call, the silence felt oppressive. The radio offered nothing but static between stations, and the darkness beyond her headlights seemed to pulse with malevolent possibility. She'd driven this route countless times over the years, visiting Sarah at college, helping her move into her first apartment, attending her wedding to Miguel 3 years ago. Ordinary trips filled with ordinary conversation about ordinary problems. Now she was fleeing through the same landscape like a fugitive, carrying stolen evidence and the weight of terrible knowledge. The exit signs for Baton Rouge began appearing with increasing frequency, each one marking her deeper descent into a reality she couldn't control. There would be no backing out after this. Once she explained to Sarah what the Harrow sisters had revealed, once she admitted that her own career had been built on a foundation of conspiracy and murdered children, there would be no returning to ignorance. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Against every instinct, Maggie glanced down at the screen. "Beautiful night for a drive. Give our regards to Sarah." The car swerved slightly as her hands jerked on the steering wheel. She fumbled for the phone, nearly dropping it as she tried to capture a screenshot of the message. But by the time she managed to focus on the screen, the text had vanished as if it had never existed. They were watching. They had been watching all along, probably since the moment she'd walked out of that interview room, with the sisters' words burning in her memory. The realization that she'd led them straight to Sarah made her stomach clench with self-loathing. In her desperation to protect her daughter, she might have painted a target on both their backs. But what choice did she have? The alternative was to pretend that photograph didn't exist, that Ruth Harrow's pale eyes hadn't held the truth about Katie's disappearance. The alternative was to let sleeping monsters lie, while Sarah lived her life in the shadow of secrets that could swallow her whole. The Baton Rouge city limits materialized out of the darkness, familiar landmarks taking on an alien quality in her heightened state of awareness. Every passing car could be surveillance. Every shadow could hide a threat. She'd entered a world where paranoia and reality had become indistinguishable, where 30 years of police instinct suddenly felt inadequate against an enemy that had been hiding in plain sight. Miguel's parents lived in a quiet subdivision where well-maintained lawns spoke of middle-class stability and carefully tended dreams. As Maggie pulled into their driveway, she could see Sarah's silhouette in the living room window, pacing with nervous energy. The sight of her daughter, alive, safe, still within reach, made her throat constrict with emotion. She sat in the darkened car for a moment, gathering herself for what came next. Once she walked through that front door, there would be no more comfortable lies, no more carefully constructed normalcy. She would have to tell Sarah the truth about Katie, about Pine Ridge, about the probability that the men who'd destroyed one daughter had been watching the other for 30 years. The thumb drive felt warm in her pocket as she finally stepped out into the humid night air. Behind her, the interstate hummed with late-night traffic, carrying ordinary people toward ordinary destinations. Ahead lay the terrible intimacy of truth-telling and the unknown consequences of a choice she could no longer unmake. Maggie walked toward the house where her remaining daughter waited, crossing the threshold into a darkness that might swallow them both. The front door opened before Maggie could knock, revealing Sarah's anxious face framed by the warm light of the foyer. At 37, her daughter still carried traces of the frightened 7-year-old who had once waited alone in Riverside Park, though she didn't know it yet. Sarah's dark hair was pulled back in a hasty ponytail, and she wore the same expression of controlled worry that had marked her features during every family crisis since Katie's disappearance. "Mom," Sarah's voice carried relief and fear in equal measure. "You look like hell." Maggie stepped inside, immediately aware of Miguel's parents hovering in the living room archway, Elena clutching a coffee mug, Roberto still in his work clothes despite the late hour. Their faces held the polite concern of people caught in someone else's emergency, unsure whether to offer help or retreat. "Mrs. Chen," Elena said softly, "Sarah didn't tell us much, but if there's anything—" "Thank you for taking care of her," Maggie interrupted, her voice rougher than intended. "But we need to leave tonight." Sarah's eyebrows shot up. "Tonight? Mom, it's almost midnight. Whatever this is—" "Can't wait!" Maggie's eyes swept the room automatically, cataloguing sightlines and exit routes. The habits of paranoia were already taking hold. "Go get your bag. I'm not going anywhere until you tell me what's happening." Sarah planted her feet in that stubborn stance Maggie remembered from countless teenage arguments. You show up here looking like you haven't slept in days, talking about threats and dangers, and now you want me to disappear into the night without explanation? The familiar rhythm of their conflict felt surreal against the backdrop of approaching catastrophe. Maggie could feel time slipping away, each second of delay giving their enemies more opportunity to close whatever net they were weaving. But she also recognized the steel in Sarah's voice. The same determination that had helped her rebuild after Katie's loss would not bend easily to mystery and evasion. "There are people who want to hurt us," Maggie said finally. "People I trusted. People I worked with for 30 years who—" She stopped, aware that Elena and Roberto were listening to every word. Some truths were too dangerous to speak in front of innocent bystanders. Sarah studied her mother's face with the sharp perception that came from years of reading unspoken grief. "This is about Katie, isn't it?" The name hung in the air like a physical presence. Elena and Roberto exchanged uncomfortable glances. Sarah had told them about her missing sister years ago, during the early days of her relationship with Miguel, but it wasn't something the family discussed casually. "Sarah," Maggie said carefully, "I need you to trust me. Just for tonight. I promise I'll explain everything once we're somewhere safe." "Safe from who?" Sarah's voice rose with frustration. "Mom, you're a cop. If there's a threat, why aren't we calling for backup? Why aren't we involving the department?" "Because the department might be part of the problem. Because Captain Hendricks had somehow known about the break-in at Sarah's house before Maggie had even finished processing it herself. Because 30 years of faith in the system was crumbling like sand between her fingers. Some problems can't be solved with backup," Maggie said instead. Roberto cleared his throat diplomatically. "Perhaps you ladies would like some privacy. Elena and I can—" A car engine rumbled in the driveway outside, growing louder as it approached the house. Maggie's hand moved instinctively toward her service weapon as she stepped to the window, peering through the blinds at the dark sedan pulling up behind her own vehicle. 2 men in the front seat, shadows too deep to reveal faces, but something about their stillness suggested professional observation rather than casual arrival. "Sarah," Maggie said quietly, "where's the back door?" "What? Why?" Sarah moved to join her at the window, but Maggie caught her arm. "Back door. Now." The urgency in her mother's voice finally penetrated Sarah's confusion. "Through the kitchen." "But Mom—" "Elena, Roberto, I'm sorry for bringing this to your home." Maggie was already moving, pulling Sarah toward the rear of the house. "If anyone asks, we were never here." Elena's coffee mug trembled in her hands. "Should we call the police?" "No," Maggie said sharply. "Don't call anyone. Just forget we came." The kitchen led to a small screened porch overlooking a backyard bordered by mature oak trees. Maggie tested the back door, unlocked, thank God, and peered out into the darkness beyond. The neighboring houses showed no signs of surveillance, but that meant nothing. If they'd found Sarah this quickly, they'd had time to position assets throughout the area. Sarah grabbed her mother's arm as they stepped onto the porch. "I'm not taking another step until you tell me who those men are." Maggie turned to face her daughter, seeing Katie's stubborn courage reflected in Sarah's eyes. The terrible irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent 30 years protecting Sarah from the truth about her sister's disappearance, only to discover that the truth was hunting them both. "The men who took Katie," she said simply. "They've been watching you your whole life. And now they know I know." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Her face went white in the dim porch light, and for a moment she swayed as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. Behind them, through the kitchen window, Elena and Roberto's voices murmured in urgent Spanish as they presumably watched a sedan in their driveway. "That's impossible," Sarah whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. Maggie could see the quick intelligence behind her daughter's eyes, already processing years of half-remembered details, the way her mother had always insisted on knowing her exact whereabouts, the elaborate security systems in every house they'd lived in, the careful background checks before Sarah had been allowed to date anyone seriously. "I wish it was." Maggie pulled her daughter deeper into the shadows of the backyard, away from the house's revealing lights. "We need to move." They won't wait long before coming to the door. Sarah's breathing had become shallow, rapid. "How long have you known?" "I found out today." The admission felt like swallowing broken glass. Everything I thought I knew about Katie's case, about the people I worked with, it's all been a lie. They reached the line of oak trees that marked the back boundary of the property. Through the branches, Maggie could see the faint glow of streetlights from the next subdivision over. A quarter-mile of careful movement through backyards and side streets would get them to her car's current location. Seemed compromised. "Mom." Sarah's voice was steadier now, though Maggie could see her hands shaking. "When you say they've been watching me, I don't know all the details yet. But yes, I think someone has kept tabs on you your entire life." The truth felt like poison on her tongue. The men at your school who said they were security guards, the helpful strangers who appeared whenever you were alone in public places, even Miguel. "Miguel?" Sarah's voice spiked with alarm. "I don't know," Maggie said quickly, "but we can't assume anyone is safe until we understand how deep this goes." A door slammed in the distance. The front door of Elena and Roberto's house. Male voices, polite but insistent, asking questions about visitors. Maggie grabbed Sarah's hand and pulled her into the deeper darkness between the trees. They moved in silence, branches catching at their clothes as they navigated the uneven ground. Behind them, the voices grew louder, more demanding. A flashlight beam swept across the backyard they'd just vacated, its harsh white circle probing the spaces where they might have hidden. Sarah stumbled over a root and Maggie caught her, feeling her daughter's terror in the way she gripped her arm. This was wrong. Sarah should be safe in her bed, worrying about ordinary things like work deadlines and weekend plans. Instead, she was fleeing through darkness because her mother had finally pulled on a thread that unraveled 30 years of carefully constructed lies. "Where are we going?" Sarah breathed. "Hotel. Somewhere public with cameras and witnesses." Maggie's mind raced through possibilities and discarded them just as quickly. Credit cards could be traced. Cell phones could be tracked. Even ATMs would leave digital breadcrumbs for people with the right access and motivation. They emerged onto a quiet residential street 2 blocks from Elena and Roberto's house. Maggie's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Your friends are very worried about you. Perhaps it's time to come in from the cold." She showed the screen to Sarah, whose face went pale again. "They're using burner phones, professional-grade equipment. You know about burner phones?" "I watch crime shows." Sarah's attempt at normalcy fell flat in the darkness between streetlights. "Mom, if these people are as dangerous as you're saying, why haven't they just killed us?" Maggie finished the question her daughter couldn't voice. "Because they need something from me first. Information about what I know, who I've told, what evidence exists." Another text arrived, Detective Chen. "You're putting innocent people in danger. Let's discuss this like professionals." The phone number was different from the first message, suggesting multiple operatives with coordinated communication. Maggie powered off the device and removed the battery, a precaution that felt both paranoid and inadequate. "We need transportation. They can't track," she murmured, scanning the empty street. Most of the houses showed no signs of life at this hour, driveways filled with cars whose owners slept peacefully, unaware that their quiet neighborhood had become a hunting ground. Sarah understood immediately. "You want to steal a car." "Borrow," Maggie corrected, though the distinction felt meaningless. She was already crossing lines she'd spent her career defending, becoming the kind of person she'd once arrested. But the alternative was trusting a system that had been compromised from the beginning. They approached a faded blue sedan parked under a broken streetlight, its location offering both concealment and easy access to the main road. As Maggie examined the locks, she could hear Sarah's breathing behind her. Rapid, shallow, the sound of someone's world reshaping itself around terrible new possibilities. "Whatever happens next," Maggie said softly, "I need you to know that everything I did was to protect you." "I know, Mom," Sarah's voice carried a strength that reminded Maggie painfully of Katie at the same age. "Now let's get the hell out of here." The car door gave way with a metallic scrape that sounded deafening in the quiet street. Maggie's hands moved with muscle memory she'd hoped never to use again. Skills learned during an undercover assignment 20 years ago, back when the world still made sense, and the badge on her chest meant something pure. Sarah climbed into the passenger seat without comment, her silence more unnerving than protests would have been. As Maggie worked to start the engine, she caught glimpses of her daughter's profile in the dim dashboard light, jaw set, eyes fixed on the road ahead with an intensity that spoke of terrible understanding finally taking root. The engine turned over on the third try, coughing to life with a reluctant wheeze. As they pulled away from the curb, Maggie's rearview mirror caught the sweep of flashlight beams 2 blocks behind them, searching the spaces where they'd hidden. Too close. Everything was happening too fast, the net tightening with professional precision that made her stomach clench with recognition. "Where exactly are we going?" Sarah's voice was carefully controlled, but Maggie could hear the fractures underneath. "I don't know yet." The admission felt like failure. 30 years of police work, and she was reduced to running blind through a city that no longer felt familiar, somewhere they won't expect. Sarah's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, and Maggie saw her face go white in the screen's glow. "It's Miguel. He says there are police at our apartment asking about you." The words hit Maggie like ice water. If they were moving openly now, involving local departments and using official channels, it meant the pretense of subtlety was over. They'd committed to a course of action that required her silence, permanent silence. "Don't answer," Maggie said, though she could see the pain in Sarah's eyes. Another relationship poisoned by proximity to the truth. Another innocent person dragged into the web of consequences that had been spinning around them for 3 decades. They drove in silence through empty streets, past all-night diners and gas stations that represented normalcy neither of them could access. Every pair of headlights in the mirror could be pursuit. Every police cruiser at an intersection could be the beginning of the end. "Tell me about Katie," Sarah said suddenly. The request caught Maggie off guard. In 30 years, Sarah had rarely asked direct questions about her missing sister, seeming to understand instinctively that the subject was a minefield of unhealed wounds. "What do you want to know?" "Everything you haven't told me." Sarah's voice was steady now, drawing strength from somewhere deep inside. "If we're both in danger because of what happened to her, I deserve to know what I'm running from." Maggie felt the weight of the thumb drive in her pocket, its plastic surface warm against her fingers. Ruth Harrow's photograph was burned into her memory, Katie's young face staring out from a group of children who should have been protected, who instead had been fed to monsters wearing respectable masks. "She wasn't taken by a stranger," Maggie began, the words coming slowly at first, then faster as the dam of silence finally broke. There was a network, prominent people, judges, businessmen, police officers. They called it Pine Ridge, but it was bigger than that. Much bigger. Sarah's breathing had gone shallow again, but she didn't interrupt. The Harrow sisters, Evelyn and Ruth, they were convicted for the murders, but they weren't the ones in charge. They were just the cleanup crew. The real predators were untouchable, protected by money and position, and a system that buried evidence rather than expose the truth. "And you found out today?" The sisters finally talked. After 30 years of silence, they decided to burn it all down. Maggie's hands gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles went white. "They showed me proof, photographs, documents. Katie wasn't just taken, she was selected, chosen specifically because I was a cop, because having a detective's daughter in their collection gave them leverage." The silence that followed was deafening. Maggie could feel Sarah processing the implications, understanding dawning like a cold sunrise. "They've been watching me because I'm leveraged too," Sarah said finally. "Yes," the word came out as a whisper. "As long as you were alive and safe, they owned me. My career, my cases, my silence. Everything was built on the threat of losing you the same way I lost Katie." Sarah's phone rang, Miguel's name flashing on the screen. This time she answered, putting it on speaker with shaking hands. "Sarah, thank God." Miguel's voice was tight with fear. "Baby, there are federal agents here. They're saying your mother is wanted for questioning in connection with terrorist activities. They want to know where you are." Sarah looked at her mother, seeing 30 years of careful lies crumbling in real time. "I don't know where she is," she said, her voice breaking on the words. "Sarah, if she contacts you, if she tries to involve you in whatever this is, you need to call me immediately. These people say she's dangerous." Maggie reached over and ended the call, watching her daughter's face crumple with the weight of choices no one should have to make. "Now you understand," Maggie said softly. "This is what truth costs." Sarah stared at the phone's black screen for a long moment before carefully placing it on the dashboard. When she spoke, her voice was hollow, drained of the fight that had sustained her through the night's revelations. "Federal agents," she said. "They're calling you a terrorist." Maggie felt something vital break inside her chest. 30 years of service, of putting her life on the line for justice, reduced to whatever narrative they needed to spin. The badge in her wallet, the symbol she'd worn with pride since Katie's disappearance drove her into law enforcement, had become worthless metal, stripped of meaning by the very system it represented. "Miguel thinks I'm dangerous," Sarah continued, her words barely audible over the stolen car's labored engine. "The man I love, who I was going to—" She stopped, pressing her fingers to her mouth. "Going to what?" "Marry." The word came out broken. "He was going to propose this weekend. He showed me the ring last month, wanted to make sure I'd like it." Sarah's laugh was bitter, raw. "We had everything planned. The restaurant where we had our first date. Dinner with Elena and Roberto afterward to celebrate." Each word was a knife in Maggie's gut. Another life destroyed by proximity to the truth she'd finally chosen to pursue. Another dream crumbling because she'd been too weak to carry her secrets to the grave. "Sarah, Don't." Sarah's voice turned sharp. "Don't apologize. Not when you're about to lose everything too." She was right, Maggie realized with cold clarity. By morning, her career would be over, her reputation destroyed. Every case she'd ever worked would be questioned, every conviction potentially overturned on the grounds that the investigating officer had been compromised. Decades of justice undone because she'd finally tried to deliver it. The police radio in the stolen car crackled to life, startling them both. All units, Bolo for Detective Margaret Chen, considered armed and dangerous. Last seen operating a dark sedan in the Riverside district. Approach with extreme caution. Her own voice, her own department, hunting her like a common criminal. Maggie reached over and turned off the radio, but the damage was done. Sarah had heard how easily the system could pivot, how quickly protection became persecution when the wrong people felt threatened. "They're really going to destroy you," Sarah whispered. "They already have." Maggie pulled into the parking lot of a 24-hour diner, its neon sign flickering weakly in the pre-dawn darkness. "The question is whether we let them destroy the truth too." She pulled the thumb drive from her pocket, its small plastic case containing everything Ruth Harrow had died to reveal. In her other hand, her phone buzzed with another text. "Detective Chen, you have 2 hours to surrender yourself and return our property. After that, we stop being polite." Sarah read the message over her mother's shoulder. "Property?" Maggie held up the drive. "Proof, names, photographs, financial records, everything they've killed to keep hidden, including Katie's murder." Including Katie's murder. The words tasted like ash, and probably a dozen other children whose families never got answers. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the empty highway where the occasional truck rolled past, drivers unaware that 2 women sat in a parking lot watching their lives disintegrate in real time. "If you give them what they want," Sarah said finally, "do you think they'll let us go?" The question hung between them like smoke. Maggie thought about Ruth Harrow, dead hours after breaking her silence. About the careful orchestration that had turned her from detective into fugitive in less than a day. about the resources and reach it took to coordinate federal agencies, local police, and private operatives into a seamless machine of suppression. "No," she said quietly, "we know too much now. We've seen too much." Sarah's phone buzzed again, a text from Miguel that made her face crumple. "I love you, but I can't be involved in whatever your mother has gotten you into. I'm sorry." The stolen car's engine ticked in the sudden silence, cooling metal contracting with small, sharp sounds, like breaking bones. Inside the diner, a lone waitress moved between empty tables, unaware that the parking lot held two women who'd lost everything in the space of a single night. "So what now?" Sarah asked, her voice small and defeated. Maggie looked at her daughter, really looked at her, seeing not just Katie's sister, but a woman who'd built a life of meaning and connection, all of it now shattered by proximity to secrets that should have stayed buried. The weight of the thumb drive in her palm felt enormous, heavier than 30 years of guilt and silence. "Now," she said, "we decide if the truth is worth dying for." Above them, the diner's neon sign buzzed and flickered, casting intermittent light into a stolen car where everything they'd ever believed about justice sat broken between them like glass. The diner's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across Sarah's face as she stared at the thumb drive in her mother's palm. For 30 seconds, neither woman spoke, the weight of the decision pressing down on them like the humid Louisiana air that even the night couldn't dispel. Then Sarah reached out and closed her fingers over Maggie's hand, trapping the drive between their palms. "You've been carrying this alone for 30 years, Sarah said, her voice steady despite the tears tracking down her cheeks. "Katie's death, the guilt, the watching and waiting. You gave up everything to keep me safe, and what did it get us? They still took Miguel. They still destroyed your career. They're still going to kill us." Maggie felt something shift inside her chest, a lock turning, a door opening onto a room she'd kept sealed since the day Katie vanished. "Sarah, you don't understand what we're up against. These aren't just criminals. They're pillars of the community, respected men with families and charities, and they rape children." The words came out flat, matter-of-fact, cutting through 30 years of Maggie's careful rationalizations. "They killed my sister. They've been using the threat of killing me to control you. They murdered Ruth Harrow in a federal prison." Sarah's grip tightened. "Mom, these aren't pillars of anything. They're monsters wearing expensive suits." The clarity in her daughter's voice was devastating. Maggie realized she was seeing Sarah clearly for the first time, not as Katie's replacement or as a victim to be protected, but as a woman who'd grown up in the shadow of an unsolved murder and somehow emerged stronger than the mother who'd failed to save her sister. "When I was 12, Sarah continued, "I started having nightmares about men coming to take me away. You remember, I couldn't sleep alone for months." Maggie nodded, the memory sharp despite the years. She'd assumed it was normal childhood anxiety, the kind of fears that come and go without explanation. "It wasn't random nightmares," Sarah said. "I'd started noticing things. The same man at my school pickup 3 days in a row, a car following us home from soccer practice. You taught me to be observant, to trust my instincts, and my instincts were screaming that something was wrong." The revelation hit Maggie like a physical blow. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I could see what it was doing to you. The hypervigilance, the way you checked the locks 3 times every night, how you never let me out of your sight unless I was with Elena and Roberto." Sarah's voice broke slightly. "I was 12 years old, and I already understood that telling you would destroy what little peace you'd managed to find. 30 years of protection, and it had been an illusion." Sarah had seen the Watchers, felt the threat, carried the knowledge that she was a target. She'd grown up not just motherless, Katie's death had taken that from her, but burdened with the adult understanding that safety was a lie they told themselves to function. "Jesus, Sarah," Maggie's voice was barely a whisper. "I'm so sorry." "Don't be sorry," Sarah said fiercely. "Be angry, be furious. They stole our family, our lives, our choices. They made me an orphan with a living mother because you were so broken by guilt and fear that you could barely touch me without seeing Katie's ghost." The words were surgical in their precision, cutting away the scar tissue Maggie had built around her heart. She thought of all the school plays she'd missed because work suddenly demanded her attention, the birthday parties where she'd stood at the edge of the room watching Sarah laugh with other families, unable to bridge the gap her own trauma had created, the thousand small moments of connection she'd sacrificed on the altar of her guilt. "They didn't just kill Katie," Maggie whispered, understanding finally breaking over her like a wave. "They killed our whole family. They made me so afraid of losing you that I never really let myself have you." Sarah nodded, tears flowing freely now. "And they made me so afraid of losing the only parent I had left that I never told you what I saw, what I suspected. We've been protecting each other from shadows for 30 years, while the real monsters laughed at how well their system worked." Maggie looked at the thumb drive again, seeing it not as evidence now, but as a key, not just to Katie's murder, but to the prison they'd been living in since the day she disappeared. Every careful choice, every fearful calculation, every sacrifice made in the name of Sarah's safety had been orchestrated by the very people who'd taken Katie. They'd been dancing to a tune composed by child killers, and the music had to stop. "Ruth Harrow died to get this to us," Maggie said, her voice growing stronger. "Katie died because we didn't know it existed. So what do we do with it?" Maggie looked at her daughter, really looked at her, and saw not a victim to be protected, but a partner who'd been fighting this war alongside her since childhood. The realization was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. "We burn it all down," she said. The words hung in the air between them like a battle cry, and for the first time in 30 years, Maggie felt something she'd forgotten existed, hope backed by fury instead of fear. Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, leaving streaks across her cheek that made her look younger and older simultaneously. "Okay, but we can't do it from a stolen car in a diner parking lot with every law enforcement agency in Louisiana hunting us." Maggie's phone buzzed again. Another message from the unknown number, 1 hour 47 minutes remaining. She turned the phone face down, cutting off their countdown to surrender. "We need somewhere safe to examine what's on the drive. Somewhere with internet access and enough time to copy everything before they find us." She ran through possibilities in her mind, discarding each one. Her apartment was compromised. The police station was obviously out. Hotels required ID that would ping their location within minutes. "Elena and Roberto's," Sarah said suddenly. "Absolutely not. I won't put them in danger. They're already in danger." Sarah's voice carried new steel. "Don't you see? Everyone connected to us has been at risk this whole time. Miguel, Elena, Roberto, your partner Dave. They've all been potential leverage points. The only difference is now we're admitting it." The logic was sound, but it violated every protective instinct Maggie had developed. Then she remembered Elena's face when she dropped Sarah off earlier, the knowing look, the careful questions about whether everything was all right. Elena had raised 6 children, survived immigration, built a life through pure determination. She wasn't fragile. "Elena has been watching over me since I was 7, Sarah continued. "She knows about Katie. She knows about your nightmares, your obsession with locked doors, the way you flinch when children go missing on the news. She's not stupid, Mom. She's been waiting 30 years for this conversation." Maggie started the engine, decision crystallizing. "If we do this, there's no going back. Once we open that drive, once we start making copies and sending it to journalists and prosecutors, they'll stop playing games. It becomes life or death. It's already life or death. We're just finally choosing to fight back." The drive to Elena's house took 20 minutes through back roads, avoiding main thoroughfares where patrol cars might be waiting. Sarah directed her through neighborhoods she barely recognized, past houses where families slept peacefully, unaware that 2 women were driving through their streets, carrying evidence of horrors that would shatter the comfortable illusion of safety. Elena's porch light was on despite the early hour, and Maggie could see her silhouette in the kitchen window, moving with the purposeful efficiency of someone who'd been awake for a while. She answered the door before they could knock, wearing a robe but fully alert, as if she'd been expecting them. "Mija," she said to Sarah. pulling her into a fierce embrace. Then she looked at Maggie with eyes that held 3 decades of unasked questions. "Detective Chen, come inside, quickly." The kitchen smelled like coffee and fresh bread, aggressively normal scents that made Maggie's throat tighten. Elena poured 3 cups without asking, her movements economical and sure. Roberto appeared in the doorway wearing pajamas and a concerned expression, but Elena spoke to him in rapid Spanish, and he nodded, disappearing back upstairs. "He's moving his computer to the basement," Elena explained. "Better privacy and the windows are small, harder for anyone to see inside." "Elena, you don't understand what you're getting into," Maggie began, but the older woman cut her off with a raised hand. "I understand perfectly. My Sarah calls me at 4 in the morning saying she needs somewhere safe to work on something important. You look like you haven't slept in days, and there are police cars that have driven past my house 3 times since midnight." Elena's voice carried the authority of someone who'd navigated worse dangers. "You think I don't know what hunting looks like? I came from El Salvador in 1985. I know how quickly the protectors become the predators." Sarah squeezed Elena's hand. "This is about Katie." Something shifted in Elena's expression, a settling, as if pieces of a puzzle she'd been holding for years had finally clicked into place. "The sister who disappeared. The sister who was murdered," Sarah corrected. "We have proof now, evidence that shows who killed her and why." Elena was quiet for a moment, studying Maggie's face. Then she nodded once, decisive. "Good. That child deserves justice, and you deserve peace. Roberto has set up the computer. There's food if you need it, and I've made up the guest room in case—" "We can't stay," Maggie interrupted. "It's not safe, for any of us." "Nowhere is safe," Elena replied matter-of-factly. "But some places have better coffee and people who love you. Now come, show me what 30 years of silence looks like when it finally breaks." The basement was cooler than the rest of the house, paneled in dark wood that absorbed the light from Roberto's desk lamp. 3 mismatched chairs formed a semicircle around an aging but well-maintained computer setup, cables snaking between monitors like electronic ivy. The space felt like a bunker, insulated from the world above where morning was beginning to creep across Louisiana. Maggie's hands trembled slightly as she inserted the thumb drive. The simple click of plastic against metal sounded enormous in the quiet basement, final as a gunshot. Once this information was out, there would be no putting it back, no return to the careful balance of fear and ignorance that had governed her life for 3 decades. "Whatever we see," she said, looking at Sarah and Elena, "there's no unseeing it." Sarah reached over and covered her hand on the mouse. "Good. I'm tired of not seeing." The drive contained 47 files, financial records, photographs, correspondence, and video files that made Maggie's blood freeze just reading their clinical labels: subject assessment, Pine Ridge 1994, procurement documentation, disposal protocols. Each file name was a breadcrumb, leading deeper into a labyrinth of systematic horror. Elena leaned forward, reading over Maggie's shoulder. Her English was excellent, but some of the legal terminology required translation that Sarah provided in whispered Spanish. With each explanation, Elena's expression grew harder, more resolved. This woman who'd survived war and displacement was looking at evil in its purest form, and she wasn't flinching. "These names," Elena said, pointing to a document titled Membership Roster 1990 to 1995. "I know some of these men. The judge who handled my citizenship case, the doctor who delivered 2 of my grandchildren." The list was alphabetical, typed on letterhead from something called the Pine Ridge Educational Foundation. 23 names, including 3 sitting city council members, a federal judge, and Dr. Marcus Webb, the pediatrician who'd examined Katie the week before she disappeared. Maggie felt the world tilt sideways. The man who'd given Katie her final physical, who'd declared her healthy and normal, had been documenting her for something unspeakable. The gentle doctor who'd told Maggie that Katie was developing beautifully, who'd recommended vitamins and regular checkups, had been cataloguing her daughter like livestock. "Mom?" Sarah's voice seemed to come from very far away. "What is it?" Maggie couldn't speak. She opened the folder labeled Medical Documentation and found Katie's name immediately. Her daughter's photograph stared back at her from a clinical assessment form, but the details below weren't about wellness or growth charts. They were specifications, measurements, a cold evaluation of suitability for purposes that made bile rise in Maggie's throat. "They shopped for her," she whispered. "They looked at my baby and shopped for her like she was something they could buy." Elena's hand landed on her shoulder, warm and steady. "But now you know. Now you can show the world who they really are." Sarah was already copying files to a cloud storage account, her fingers flying over the keyboard with desperate efficiency. "We need multiple copies, different platforms, different locations. The video files," Maggie said, her voice hollow. "We need to know what's on them." They were encrypted, but Roberto appeared at the bottom of the stairs with a cup of coffee and a flash drive of his own. "Decryption software," he explained in careful English. "From my nephew who works in IT, he says it can open anything." The first video file took 3 minutes to decrypt, 3 minutes during which Maggie's entire worldview hung in the balance, poised between the comfortable lie of not knowing and the terrible clarity of truth. When the file opened, she was looking at a conference room she recognized, the chamber where the city council held their public meetings. But this wasn't a public meeting. This was 1994, and the men around the table were discussing children like commodities. Their voices were casual, businesslike, as they planned procurement and distribution with the same tone they might use to discuss municipal budgets. Mayor Richard Holbrook, still in office, still glad-handing at ribbon cuttings and charity events, was explaining the importance of discretion. Judge William Morrison was outlining legal protections, Dr. Webb was providing medical assessments, and Katie's name came up like it meant nothing. "The Chen girl meets all specifications," Dr. Webb's recorded voice said, consulting notes that Maggie now knew were from Katie's last checkup. "Excellent health, appropriate age, limited family support structure since the divorce." Limited family support structure. They'd factored her broken marriage into their equation, calculated that a single mother with no extended family would be easier prey. Sarah made a small sound beside her. Not quite a sob, not quite a scream. Elena's grip on Maggie's shoulder tightened, anchoring her as everything she'd believed about her daughter's disappearance crumbled into something infinitely worse. But underneath the horror, something else was building. Rage, pure and focused, burning away 30 years of fear and self-doubt. These monsters had taken her daughter. They'd turned her into a broken woman who couldn't even hold her surviving child properly. Now she had their confessions in their own voices. Limited family support structure. The phrase echoed in Maggie's mind as she stared at the frozen video frame showing Dr. Webb's casual notation. Her broken marriage, her isolation, her vulnerability, they'd weaponized every moment of weakness in her life. "We send this now," Maggie said, her voice cutting through the basement air like a blade. "Everything. To every news outlet, every federal prosecutor, every journalist who's ever covered corruption cases." Sarah's fingers were already moving across the keyboard. FBI field office in New Orleans, State Attorney General, Washington Post investigative team. Each click sent another copy of the evidence spiraling out into the world beyond the reach of Pine Ridge's corruption. Elena moved to the window, peering through the narrow basement opening. "There's a car," she said quietly. "Dark sedan, 2 men inside. They've been sitting at the corner for 5 minutes." Maggie felt the familiar clutch of fear, but this time it transformed into something harder, more useful. They'd found Elena's house, which meant they were running out of time, but the evidence was already spreading, multiplying across servers and inboxes beyond their control. "How much more needs to upload?" she asked Sarah. "The financial records and the rest of the videos. Maybe 10 minutes. 10 minutes. Maggie calculated distances, response times, the logistics of escape versus the mathematics of exposure. Every second the files remained uploading was another chance for the truth to take root somewhere they couldn't tear it out. Her phone buzzed. "Time's up, detective. Surrender now or face consequences." Instead of the usual spike of terror, Maggie felt something crystallize inside her chest. She typed back, "Check your email, all of it. Names, dates, recordings. You're finished." The response came immediately, "You have no idea what you've unleashed." "Maybe not," she said aloud, showing the message to Sarah and Elena. "But 30 years ago, they took my daughter and made me into a victim who was grateful just to have one child left alive. Today, I'm choosing to be their nightmare instead." Roberto appeared at the stairs again, moving with urgent quiet. "More cars," he reported. "3 now. They're positioning for a perimeter." Elena's expression hardened. "There's another way out. Through the cellar door to the backyard, then over the fence to the Hernandez property. They won't expect it." Sarah was downloading the last files to multiple drives, her movements efficient despite the mounting pressure. Almost done. 2 more minutes. The sound of car doors slamming filtered through the basement walls. Maggie counted them. 1, 2, 3. At least 6 people, possibly more. They'd brought serious numbers, which meant they were either planning to arrest her or something worse. "Mom." Sarah's voice was steady, but her eyes held the weight of everything they'd discovered. "Whatever happens next, Katie gets justice. That's what matters." Elena unplugged the computer equipment with practiced efficiency, as if she'd prepared for this moment years ago. "Roberto will take the drives to his cousin in Baton Rouge. From there, copies go to 3 different lawyers and a journalist in New York." The doorbell rang upstairs. Polite, civilized, the sound of people who still believed they controlled the narrative. Maggie almost laughed at the absurdity of it. They were about to arrest or kill the detective who just exposed their 3-decade conspiracy, and they were asking permission to enter. "Detective Chen," a voice called from the front door. "We need to speak with you. Come out, and no one gets hurt." The lie in those words was breathtaking. These people had built careers on hurt, had systematized it, monetized it, turned children into commodities and parents into broken shells. Now they were offering mercy they'd never shown and protection they'd never provided. Sarah grabbed her arm. The cellar door. Now. But Maggie found herself reluctant to run. For 30 years she'd lived in the spaces they'd allowed her, moved through a world they'd designed, carried fear they'd manufactured. Running felt like returning to that powerless version of herself, the woman who'd been grateful just to survive their attention. "No," she said quietly. "I'm done running from them." Elena stared at her. "Detective, this is not the time for heroics." "It's not heroics, it's mathematics." Maggie pulled out her phone, opening the camera app. "Every second I keep them talking is another second for the evidence to spread. Another journalist opening those files, another prosecutor seeing those videos. They can arrest me, but they can't arrest the truth once it's everywhere." Sarah understood first. "You're going to record them, make them confess on video." The doorbell rang again, followed by harder knocking. Their patience was wearing thin, which meant their confidence was shaking. They wouldn't be here, wouldn't be this desperate, unless they knew the evidence was real and devastating. Maggie started up the basement stairs, her phone recording, her heart hammering with something that felt remarkably like joy. After 3 decades of being their victim, she was about to become their judge. The front door stood between Maggie and 30 years of reckoning. Through the peephole, she could see Richard Holbrook himself, still mayor after all these years, still wearing the practiced smile that had charmed voters while he orchestrated horrors. Behind him stood Dr. Webb, aged but unmistakable, and 3 men in suits who radiated the kind of authority that came from never being questioned. Maggie opened the door with her phone recording at her side, angled to catch both video and audio. "Mayor Holbrook," she said, her voice steady. "Dr. Webb, come to discuss old times?" Holbrook's smile faltered for just a moment before reassembling itself. "Detective Chen, we need to have a conversation about some misunderstandings that have come to light." "Misunderstandings?" Maggie stepped onto the porch, closing the door behind her to keep the focus on her and away from Elena's family. "Is that what you call Katie's murder now?" The word hung in the morning air like a blade. Dr. Webb stepped forward, his face a mask of professional concern that might have fooled her once. "Margaret, you're clearly under tremendous stress. Perhaps we should discuss getting you the help you need." "The help I needed was 30 years ago." Maggie cut him off, her voice rising. "When you examined my daughter and decided she met your specifications. When you documented her like livestock for your friends." Webb's carefully constructed expression cracked. "I don't know what you think you found, but—" "I found the video, Doctor. The meeting where you discussed Katie's excellent health and appropriate age. Where you noted our limited family support structure like it was a selling point." Holbrook's hand moved toward his jacket, but Maggie was already stepping back, phone raised and clearly recording. "Please, go ahead. Show everyone watching what you really are." One of the suited men spoke for the first time. "Detective, you're in possession of stolen property and classified materials. Surrender them now, and we can discuss clemency." "Classified?" Maggie laughed, the sound sharp and broken. "Child murder isn't classified, agent whoever you are, it's evidence. And it's already in the hands of people who actually believe in justice." Webb tried a different approach, his voice taking on the gentle tone he'd probably used with countless victims. "Margaret, think about Sarah. Think about her future. You can still protect her if you're reasonable." The threat was velvet-wrapped but unmistakable. For a heartbeat, the old fear rose in Maggie's chest, the terror of losing another daughter, of being responsible for more death. Then she remembered Sarah's words, "Katie gets justice. That's what matters." "You want to know what I'm thinking about?" Maggie stepped closer, her phone capturing every micro-expression on their faces. "I'm thinking about 7 children who deserved better. I'm thinking about parents who spent 30 years wondering what happened to their babies while you collected paychecks and praised from a community you were poisoning." "You have no proof of anything," Holbrook said, but his mayor's confidence was cracking. "Wild accusations from a traumatized woman. Richard, the way Dr. Webb said his name carried decades of shared secrets. She has the files." The admission hit like a physical blow. Holbrook's practiced mask finally fell away, revealing something desperate and dangerous underneath. "Then we have a problem." "No," Maggie said, backing toward Elena's front door. "You have a problem. I have justice." One of the agents stepped forward. "Detective Chen, you're under arrest for theft of government property, obstruction of justice, and—" "What? Government property?" Maggie's voice carried across Elena's quiet neighborhood, probably waking early risers who would remember this conversation later. "Are you saying the federal government classified records of child murder, that the FBI knew about Pine Ridge and covered it up?" The agent's face went pale. In his eagerness to silence her, he'd just implicated federal authorities in the conspiracy on camera. Holbrook pulled out his phone. "End this, now." But before anyone could move, car doors slammed from multiple directions. Not more conspirators, these were different vehicles, arriving with the purposeful urgency of law enforcement who'd received urgent tips. Real law enforcement, Maggie realized. Federal agents and state investigators who'd been reading their emails for the past 20 minutes. Sarah appeared in Elena's doorway, her own phone recording. "Mom, step back. Let them sort each other out." The morning air filled with the sound of overlapping voices, badge identifications, and the beautiful chaos of predators suddenly finding themselves prey. Maggie watched Mayor Holbrook's face cycle through confusion, rage, and dawning terror as he realized his own agents were arresting him. Dr. Webb tried to run. He made it 3 steps before a genuine federal agent tackled him to Elena's front lawn, his medical bag scattering pills and syringes across the grass. Maggie wondered how many children those drugs had silenced over the years, how many small voices they'd stolen. "It's over," she said, more to herself than anyone else. 30 years of fear, 30 years of living in their shadow, finished in a single morning of truth-telling. But standing there watching justice finally unfold, Maggie felt the victory hollow out beneath her feet like rotted wood. The weight of what she'd just unleashed began to settle on her shoulders with crushing clarity. Her phone rang. Sarah answered it first, her face going white as she listened. "Mom," Sarah said, ending the call. "That was Detective Ramirez. The evidence files, they're bigger than Pine Ridge. The financial records show connections to cases across 3 states. Active cases. Children who are still missing." The magnitude hit Maggie like a physical blow. 7 dead children in Pine Ridge had been just the beginning. The network she'd exposed stretched far beyond Louisiana, beyond Dr. Webb's patient files and Mayor Holbrook's municipal corruption. She'd opened a door that revealed an abyss. Elena touched her arm. "This is good news, Detective. More victims will get justice." But Maggie was calculating the mathematics of revelation. Every name in those files represented a family that would receive the call she'd waited 30 years for, except their call would come with answers too terrible to process. Parents who'd held on to hope for decades would learn their children hadn't run away or been taken by strangers. They'd been selected, documented, processed by people they'd trusted. Agent Martinez, one of the legitimate federal investigators, approached with a tablet displaying the preliminary analysis. "Detective Chen, we need to discuss what happens next. The scope of this investigation is going to be unprecedented." Maggie looked at the screen showing an organizational chart that sprawled across multiple pages. Names, dates, connections, forming a web that reached into police departments, medical offices, children's services, and judicial systems from New Orleans to Memphis to Little Rock. "How many children?" she asked. "We're still counting. Potentially over 200 across 30 years. 200 families. 200 mothers who would get the call Maggie had dreamed of and dreaded in equal measure. The truth they'd all wanted would arrive wrapped in details that would shatter them completely. Sarah moved beside her, reading over the agent's shoulder. "Mom, look at this." She pointed to a subsection labeled Law Enforcement Coordination. Detective Ray Morrison, Detective James Burke, Detective... "Stop!" Maggie's voice came out rougher than intended. She could see where this was heading. The investigation wouldn't just expose the perpetrators, it would reveal which police officers had buried evidence, which detectives had steered investigations away from certain suspects, which departments had been compromised from the inside, including her own. Martinez's expression was sympathetic but relentless. "Detective, we're going to need your complete case files from the past 30 years. Every missing child case, every suspicious death, every investigation that went cold without explanation." The request sounded reasonable, professional, but Maggie understood what it really meant. Her entire career would be dissected under the assumption that she'd been either complicit or criminally negligent. Every case she'd worked, every family she'd promised answers, every time she'd come up empty-handed, all of it would be re-examined under the presumption that she'd failed deliberately. "Including Katie's case," she said, "especially Katie's case." The words hit her like ice water. They would scrutinize every decision she'd made as a grieving mother, every investigative choice she'd made while drowning in trauma. They would question why she'd never suspected Dr. Webb, why she'd never connected dots that seemed obvious in hindsight, why she'd accepted the official narrative for so long. Sarah stepped closer. "Mom, you didn't know. How could you have known?" But that wouldn't matter to the review boards, the internal affairs investigations, the congressional hearings that would inevitably follow. The public would want to understand how a conspiracy this massive had operated for decades. Someone would need to be held accountable for the systemic failures that had allowed it to continue. Maggie realized with crystalline clarity that getting justice for Katie meant sacrificing everything else she'd built in the aftermath of losing her. Her career, her reputation, her identity as a detective who'd fought for victims even when she couldn't save her own daughter. All of it would be consumed by the investigation she'd just triggered. "Detective Chen," Agent Martinez was waiting for her response. "We'll need you to surrender your badge and service weapon pending the investigation." There it was. The price of truth served as coldly as a subpoena. She'd spent 30 years building a life around seeking justice for others, and now that work would be dismantled piece by piece as evidence of her failure. Elena stepped forward, her voice fierce. She is the reason you have any of this. She is the reason these children will get justice. And we're grateful, Martinez said. But the investigation has to be thorough. Maggie reached for her badge, feeling the weight of it in her palm one last time. 30 years of carrying this shield, 30 years of believing she was fighting for something pure, reduced to evidence in someone else's case file. Katie gets justice, she said, echoing Sarah's words as she handed over her badge. That's what matters. But as she watched her entire life's work get catalogued as potential evidence of corruption, Maggie wondered if victory always demanded everything you thought you were fighting to protect. The steel bench in the federal building's waiting area was as unforgiving as the fluorescent lights overhead. Maggie had been sitting here for 3 hours, watching agents and prosecutors move through the hallway with the purposeful urgency of people dismantling an empire. Her empire, she realized. 30 years of cases, relationships, and professional identity being sorted into evidence boxes like artifacts from a civilization under investigation. Sarah sat beside her, occasionally checking her phone for updates from the news outlets that had begun picking up the story. Channel 6 is calling it the Pine Ridge Conspiracy. CNN wants an interview. No interviews. Maggie's voice felt foreign to her own ears, hollow, exhausted. Let the evidence speak. Through the glass partition, she could see Agent Martinez coordinating with what appeared to be half the Justice Department. The scope had expanded beyond even her worst projections. The files had revealed not just individual crimes, but an entire shadow infrastructure, a network that had operated parallel to legitimate law enforcement, child services, and medical systems. Elena emerged from one of the interview rooms, looking older than her years but somehow lighter, as if a weight she'd carried for decades had finally been lifted. She spotted Maggie through the glass and mouthed, "Thank you." The gratitude felt like another weight settling on Maggie's chest. Elena could return to her family, knowing the truth was finally public. But Maggie was discovering that vindication and peace were entirely different things. "Detective Chen?" A young prosecutor approached, tablet in hand. "I'm Jennifer Walsh, Special Prosecutor for the Pine Ridge Task Force. We need to discuss your testimony." Maggie looked up at the woman, probably Sarah's age, probably someone who'd chosen law because she believed in justice as something pure and attainable. "What do you need to know?" "Everything. Your initial investigation, your relationship with Dr. Webb, why certain leads weren't pursued." Walsh sat across from them, her expression professionally sympathetic. "I know this is difficult, but your testimony will be crucial for establishing the timeline of institutional failure." Institutional failure. The phrase was clinical, precise, and devastating. Not corruption, not conspiracy, failure, as if the system had simply malfunctioned rather than being deliberately perverted by the people sworn to protect it. Sarah leaned forward. "My mother exposed this entire network. She's the reason any of you have a case to prosecute. Which is why her testimony carries so much weight," Walsh replied. "But it also raises questions about investigative procedures during that period. The defense teams will argue that evidence was overlooked or mishandled. We need to address those challenges proactively." Maggie understood. They needed her to be the face of institutional redemption, the detective who'd ultimately done the right thing. But they also needed her to be accountable for 30 years of institutional failure. She would have to simultaneously be the hero and the cautionary tale. Her phone buzzed with a text from Detective Ramirez, "Media outside your house. Might want to find somewhere else to stay tonight." Another reality settling into place. She was no longer Detective Margaret Chen, respected homicide investigator. She was Margaret Chen, the woman at the center of the Pine Ridge scandal. Every decision she'd made, every case she'd worked, every relationship she'd built in law enforcement would now be viewed through the lens of this revelation. "There's something else," Walsh continued, consulting her tablet. We're recommending protective custody for you and your daughter. Some of the individuals we haven't arrested yet have significant resources and strong motivation to prevent this from going to trial." Sarah grabbed her hand. "Mom, they can't still be threatening us. Everyone knows the truth now." But Walsh's expression suggested otherwise. "Exposure doesn't eliminate desperation, Miss Chen. In some cases, it increases it." Through the glass partition, Maggie watched Mayor Holbrook being led past in handcuffs, his political composure finally shattered. He looked older, smaller, like a man watching his legacy crumble in real time. When he saw her through the glass, his expression shifted to something between rage and pleading, as if she might still somehow call off the reckoning she'd unleashed. She didn't look away. After 30 years of living in fear of these people, she found a bitter satisfaction in watching them experience powerlessness for the first time in their lives. But the satisfaction was brief, replaced by the growing understanding that justice was messier than she'd imagined. The truth she'd fought so hard to uncover was already being filtered through legal strategies, media narratives, and political calculations. Katie's murder would become Exhibit A in a case about systemic corruption. The 7 children of Pine Ridge would be remembered as victims in a landmark prosecution. She wondered if that was enough, if reducing their lives to evidence in service of a larger truth honored their memory or simply used them one final time. Agent Martinez appeared at Walsh's shoulder. "Detective Chen, we're ready for your formal statement." Maggie stood, feeling the weight of everything she was about to set in motion with her words. Once she began talking officially, there would be no controlling how the story spread, how it was interpreted, or what it ultimately meant. "Mom," Sarah said softly, "Katie gets justice, remember?" The reminder steadied her. Whatever came next, the trials, the media scrutiny, the dismantling of everything she'd built, Katie would finally have her truth told completely, even if that truth consumed everything else in its wake. Maggie walked into the interview room one more time, but everything had changed. The fluorescent lights seemed brighter, the walls less oppressive. For 30 years, rooms like this had been theaters of frustration, places where truth went to die beneath layers of bureaucracy and deliberate misdirection. Now the same sterile space felt like a cathedral of vindication. She sat across from Prosecutor Walsh and Agent Martinez, her hands steady for the first time in months. The tremor that had plagued her since Katie's case files were unsealed had finally stopped, not because the weight was gone. If anything, it had grown heavier, but because she was no longer carrying it alone. "From the beginning, Detective Chen," Walsh said, activating the recording device. "Tell us about Katie's disappearance." The words came easily now, without the careful editing she'd applied for 3 decades. No omissions to protect careers, no strategic silences to preserve relationships. Just the raw truth of a mother who'd lost her daughter and a detective who'd been systematically prevented from finding her killer. When she finished, 4 hours later, the room was silent except for the hum of air conditioning. Walsh's professional composure had cracked around the edges. Martinez was staring at his notes as if they contained a language he was still learning to read. "That's everything," Maggie said. "Every detail I held back, every connection I was discouraged from pursuing, every time I was redirected away from the truth." "Dr. Webb was your daughter's pediatrician," Martinez said. "You must have suspected—" "I suspected everyone and no one." The admission felt like stepping off a cliff. "When your child disappears, suspicion becomes a poison that contaminates everything. I questioned my neighbors, my colleagues, my own husband. But Webb, he was the one person offering answers when everyone else had theories. He was helping me grieve when everyone else was telling me to move on." She thought of Webb's kind face across 30 years of brief encounters. School physicals for Sarah, chance meetings at community events, the gentle way he'd spoken Katie's name when their paths crossed. The perfect camouflage of professional compassion. "The system worked exactly as designed," she continued. "Not broken or corrupted, designed. Every institutional failure was actually a success from their perspective. Every cold case, every misdirected investigation, every time a detective got too close and was transferred or discredited. Walsh leaned forward. Including your own transfers? Especially my own transfers. Every time I started connecting patterns in missing children cases, I'd find myself reassigned to gang violence or domestic disputes, always with logical explanations, department needs, budget constraints, my obvious expertise in other areas. The truth felt strange in her mouth after so many years of accepting those explanations, of believing she was serving justice even when justice was being systematically undermined around her. When the interview ended, Maggie walked out to find Sarah waiting with coffee and something that resembled hope. "How do you feel?" Sarah asked. "Different." Maggie accepted the coffee, surprised by how much she meant it. "Like I've been holding my breath for 30 years and just remembered how to exhale." They drove through Pine Ridge as the sun set, past houses where families were probably watching the news coverage, learning that their long-held suspicions about certain community leaders had been devastatingly accurate. Some would feel vindicated. Others would feel complicit for not speaking louder when they'd sensed something wrong. Elena called as they passed the memorial garden. "Detective, I wanted you to know. My sister called. She saw the news. She's coming home for the first time since 1994. Maggie closed her eyes, understanding the magnitude of that simple sentence. Families torn apart by suspicion and grief were beginning to heal. Siblings who'd blamed each other for not protecting their lost children were remembering they'd all been victims of the same conspiracy. At Sarah's apartment, they sat on the balcony watching the city lights come alive. Maggie felt lighter than she had in decades, but also unmoored. Her identity as Detective Chen was gone, suspended pending investigation. Her reputation as a competent investigator was being dissected by strangers. Her future was a blank page, waiting to be written by people she'd never meet. "Do you regret it?" Sarah asked. "Everything you're losing?" Maggie considered the question seriously. Her career was probably over. Her pension might be forfeit. The respect she'd built over 3 decades had evaporated in a single day of revelation. By tomorrow, she'd be known primarily as either a hero or a cautionary tale, depending on who was telling the story. "I regret that it took 30 years, she said finally. "I regret that I accepted their explanations for so long. I regret that Katie suffered while I was being a good soldier in a corrupt system." She paused, watching a plane cross the darkening sky, carrying people toward destinations they'd chosen freely. "But I don't regret the truth. Katie has justice now, real justice, not the sanitized version they offer to keep families quiet." For the first time since Katie disappeared, Maggie felt like a mother who had kept her most important promise, the new beginning. 6 months later, Maggie woke in her new apartment to the sound of rain against unfamiliar windows. The space was smaller than the house she'd sold, filled with second-hand furniture and boxes she hadn't found the energy to unpack. But it was hers, in a way her old life had never been, chosen freely, without the weight of institutional expectations or the ghosts of professional failure. The federal trials had concluded 2 weeks ago. Dr. Webb received life without parole. Mayor Holbrook died of a heart attack in his cell before sentencing, taking secrets to his grave that would never be fully excavated. 17 other defendants received sentences ranging from 20 years to life. The Pine Ridge conspiracy had been officially dismantled, its network of complicity mapped and prosecuted. Katie's case was officially closed. After 30 years, her file bore the stamp that had eluded every other investigation solved. Maggie made coffee and checked her phone, finding the usual mixture of interview requests and hate mail. She'd become a polarizing figure, either the detective who'd sacrificed everything for truth, or the incompetent investigator who'd enabled 3 decades of horror through willful blindness. The narrative depended entirely on who was telling it. Sarah's key turned in the lock at 9 sharp. Since the trials ended, she'd made a habit of checking on her mother daily, as if afraid Maggie might disappear into the same void that had swallowed her identity as a detective. Good, you're awake. Sarah carried groceries and the local newspaper, which she'd been screening for articles that might upset her mother. Elena called. The memorial is finished. Maggie had been avoiding the memorial dedication, unsure she could handle the weight of public gratitude. The families of the Pine Ridge victims had commissioned a garden with 7 small headstones, one for each child whose name was finally known, whose fate was no longer a mystery. Katie's stone sat among them, her brief life finally acknowledged as part of a larger tragedy. "I think I'm ready," Maggie said, surprising herself with the admission. They drove to Pine Ridge in comfortable silence, past houses where for sale signs suggested families were still fleeing the ghosts of Revelation. The memorial garden occupied the lot where Dr. Webb's clinic had stood before the FBI demolished it as a crime scene. 7 granite stones arranged in a circle around a small fountain, the sound of water providing the peace these children had been denied in life. Elena waited by the entrance with other families Maggie recognized from news coverage. Parents, siblings, people who'd spent decades wondering if their suspicions were paranoia or intuition. They greeted her with embraces that felt both grateful and apologetic, as if they understood she'd lost as much as any of them. "Detective." Elena's voice carried the formal title despite Maggie's suspension becoming permanent termination. "Thank you for coming." Katie's stone was simple: Katie Chen, beloved daughter, 1979 to 1994, truth finally known. Sarah had chosen the inscription, understanding that their family's grief had always been complicated by unanswered questions. Now they could mourn cleanly, without the poison of mystery. Maggie knelt beside the stone, pressing her palm against the cool granite. "I kept my promise," she whispered. "It took too long, but I kept it." For the first time since Katie's disappearance, Maggie felt the clean pain of simple grief. Loss without the contamination of betrayal, sorrow without the acid of institutional failure. Her daughter was gone, would always be gone, but the truth of her death no longer belonged to the people who'd killed her. "Mom?" Sarah's hand touched her shoulder. "There's something I want to show you." They drove to the community college on the other side of town, where Sarah led her to a classroom filled with adults ranging from their 20s to their 60s. A banner read, "Citizens Advocacy Training, Session 3. "I've been thinking about what you said," Sarah explained, "about being a good soldier in a corrupt system. These people want to learn how to recognize institutional failures before they calcify into conspiracies." Maggie watched the class discussing case studies, identifying red flags in missing persons investigations, learning to ask questions that 30 years ago might have saved lives. Her failure was becoming other people's education. "They want you to speak next week," Sarah said, "about what you learned, about how good people can enable terrible things without realizing it." The invitation felt both terrifying and necessary. For 30 years, she'd defined herself by her role in a system that had ultimately betrayed everything she thought she believed. But maybe her value wasn't in the badge she'd carried, but in the hard-won wisdom of having seen that system's darkest capabilities. That evening, Maggie sat at her kitchen table with a yellow legal pad, writing notes for a presentation about recognizing institutional corruption. Outside, the rain continued, washing the streets clean for whatever tomorrow might bring. She was no longer Detective Chen. She was simply Margaret, a mother who'd lost everything and found something else, a woman whose greatest failure had become her most important truth. For the first time in decades, that felt like enough.